Okay, so we're going to resume and we're going to try out the code that we kind of collectively put together in the first part of class. So if you still got your Word document open, what I'm going to do is grab all that code and just copy it. And then I'm going to try it on my local file system. So go into my htdocs. We had a lesson 2 folder from last week. I'll make a lesson 3 folder. Actually, you know what? I'll run it in here. I'll just put it right in here. So I'm just going to open up my PHP Storm. I'll open up the folder from last week and we'll make a new file and we'll copy and paste all the code into it. And then we'll try it out. So here were the files we did last week, where we had our person form and our save person page. So I'm going to make a new PHP file, and I will just call this, we'll call it persons list.php. Doesn't really matter. You can call the file anything you like. And I've got this sort of standard HTML here. I'm going to take out everything here so my page is blank. And then I'm going to paste in all the code from our Word doc. And we'll just clean it up a bit. Now, one thing that's sort of weird, these quotes are actually not the right font. So I've got to redo the quotes. So I'm just going to retype those so those quotes are straight vertical like up here. I'm also going to take out a bunch of these spaces so it's a little easier to read. Same here, I've got to redo my double quotes. And same thing down here inside my loop. I'm going to replace these kind of angled quotations. So we may have to make a few small adjustments, but we can try it and see what happens. Now, if we're connecting to my database here, I'm also going to take out any spaces up here. So if I want to try to run this file, I'm going to start up I'll open up XAMPP, and I'm going to start my local Apache server. I will try to upload this to AWS as well, but I know lots of people are only going to be able to run it on their local server today if you can't connect to AWS. So let's see what happens. I'll go to localhost. I'll go to my persons list, PHP page. Okay, we're not quite there. Line 22, it doesn't like our syntax here. Okay, so I think we can fix it this way. If we put our value name outside of the quotes, it's not a literal. My code editor likes this better. It took away the rude marks. We'll give it a refresh. And there are all of the names in the database. Round of applause for you. You guys did a good job putting this page together. It actually works the way it's supposed to. Now, each of you probably really only looked at your own section of the page, so we should probably talk through it and look at everything that's happening here. So our first line of code, this is basically what we did last week. We used PDO, right? That's the library we're going to use. You don't have to take pictures because all of this code gets uploaded to GitHub and the link is on Blackboard. So you can just see the code in your browser anytime. Okay, you don't need to fill up your camera roll. So we're connecting to a MySQL database, this server, this database name, this login. So here, so our first group, you put these three values into variables and just use the variables. That's fine, we can do that, or we could just use the values directly in line 8. Last week I didn't have these as separate variables. If our file last week, we put them right in here. Both are correct. So our connection line, it never really changes. It's the same every time. So our group 2, can you explain why, how did you know, what is this SQL doing? Why did we use this SQL command? Right. Yeah, so star means all the columns, and without any sort of where clause, it will fetch all the rows. Whether we have 1 row or 1,000,000 rows, this query will get all of the data, all of the columns in our table. So this code is actually the same as last week in our save, right? Here was our code last week for saving a new person. We prepared a command, and then when we call execute, that actually runs the SQL insert or select. So nothing happens until we call execute. That's when our PHP page actually interacts with our database using whatever SQL instruction we set up. So last week we set up an insert instruction. This week we set up a select instruction because we're reading or fetching data out of the database. Now, last week we had these 2 lines as well. So we prepared the command and we executed it, but we also had these 2 lines. This week we don't have them. We just prepared and executed. How come we needed these last week, but we don't need them this week? I know you're eating pizza. We talked about it, but your group, but maybe you could help explain to the rest of the class, where did these 2 lines go? Why didn't we need them today? Right, last week when we ran our query needed 2 values to be sent in. In order to save a person, we needed to pass in a name and an email. So we had these two bind param statements, fill the name and fill the email. How many parameters are in this SQL? How many pieces of information are we sending in here? Nope, not one. So this colon indicates a parameter. So here's our first parameter or placeholder. Here's our last week's code. How many parameters do you see in this statement? None. This statement doesn't need any values to run. It can just run on its own. We don't have to give it any other information. So we have no parameters here, so we don't need either of those lines in this case. So then we execute our query. So this actually goes to the database, grabs the list of values. So you guys did this statement, right? So can somebody explain what's happening here? What's this? We haven't used this fetch all before. What's happening? Okay, so we created a variable called persons. Why did we call it persons? Why didn't we call it like variable 1? Right, because persons describes the information we're getting. So it's a good idea if we're selecting from the persons table and asking for a list of data. We don't have to, but it might make sense to store that data in a variable with the same name. So we know what kind of information it is. Information about person. And what does this fetch all do? We haven't used that before. That's new. Right. So it's taking all of the data that our query selected and putting it into this variable. So whenever we're going to run a query to read data, we're going to use some kind of fetch command. Fetch all we'll use when we're getting a list of data. So we'll use fetch all a lot because most of the time we're getting a list. So then we have persons, and this has all of the rows with all 3 columns, the person ID, the name, and the email. So now we've got this data in a variable, and we want to print out these values to the screen. So maybe I can ask somebody from this group to explain what's happening here in lines 21 to 23. How does this work? Right. Right. Exactly. Okay, that's a good explanation, Emily. So this whole thing, this is all inside that person's variable. It has all 5 records, and every record has 3 values. An ID, a name, and an email. So persons refers to this whole thing. And we want to loop through it one at a time, starting with the first record. So our first record contains a person ID, it contains a name, it contains an email. So we're using, you guys created a second variable called value, meaning the current row as we're looping, and we're displaying not the ID or the email, we want to display the name only to the screen. So we're going to loop, and after each one, we'll add an HTML line break. And lastly, we're going to disconnect. So if I view the source of the page, we get the names, and we get our line break tag after each name. What if we wanted to also show the user's email address? So maybe we want their name, and then we'd want a space, and then we want to print their email address. We'd have to modify one line. What line number would we have to change to do this? Chris? Yep, so in 22, So we're going to print the name. So what if we want to print a space after the name? How would we do that? Yeah, we want the name, and then a space, and then their email beside it. Yep. You're not messing it up at all. Perfect. So after we print the name, print the space. And then how would we now print out the email? Ralph? Yep. So the value, again, that's the current record we're looking at. Right. Whoops, I missed our ridiculous concatenate operator here. Print the name, add on a space, print the email, add on a line break. Well, they are. In effect, persons is an array because it has all the rows, and in every row it has 3 columns: person ID, name, and email. So it basically is an array. No, we still have to refer to one column at a time. So if I save this and refresh it, oops, I guess I should refresh. There you go. So Chris and Ralph, your solution's right. Add a space after the name, and then add the email. Now our page doesn't look great, right? There's no formatting to it. This is like the world's simplest query example. And we haven't added any kind of formatting other than a BR tag around it. So we want to make it basically actually, I'm going to rename this. We'll want to create a similar version of this page, but instead we want the data to look like this. We want to show all the rows and all the columns, and we want it to be in a grid. So we want some other HTML wrapping around it so that it's formatted nicely into rows and columns. So actually, I'm just going to rename this file. We probably won't use this one again. I'm just going to right-click it. And if I choose refactor and rename, rather than call it persons list, I'll call it persons unformatted list. So there's no formatting really. It's functional, it connects to the database and shows the information, but it looks like crap. We'd never put a page like this in an actual website. So then I want to copy all of this code, because most of this code, we want to run the same code again. We want to display all of the person data, but we want to make it look better. We want to add some HTML formatting. So we've got a list of rows and columns. So I'm going to make a new PHP file. This one I'll call persons list. And it doesn't really matter what you call. So I'm going to take all of this code. I'm going to keep this time my HTML kind of head and body tags. And I'm going to paste all the code in here. So this way we have a header. We have proper HTML tags. I can put on a title. So all of the steps we did in the previous page, we all still need to do them. We need to connect to the database. We need to set up our SQL query. We need to execute the query, store the results in a variable, and then loop through it and print it out. But we want to add a whole bunch of HTML for packaging. It's almost like we're wrapping a present, right? The data is the information inside, and we can package it or present it in different ways. Just like if you're going to go to a birthday party and take somebody a gift, you could buy them something, you could package it in different ways, right? You could wrap it in wrapping paper, you could wrap it in newspaper, you could put it in a gift bag. It's the same thing inside, there's just different presentation around the outside. So we're going to use some different HTML to present this information in a more readable way. So before we loop, before we start the loop to show the data, so what HTML tag would we need here? We want to represent this in rows and columns. Right, so we'll create a table. And then we'll create a header row. So we want to do this before the loop. We only want the header to appear once at the top of the table. We don't want the headings in every row repeated. So how many columns are there in our persons table in the database? 3. So what tag would I need to set up 3 headings? Right, so we're going to use a th. So before we loop, we're going to start a table and put in 3 headings. So I'll just save the page for a minute. We'll go and look at it. So now we've got our 3 headings, ID, name, and email. So now we want to modify this line, because right now these values, notice where they get printed, up here above our table. Instead, we want to put them inside the table. So we need some other HTML wrapping or packaging around our name and email. We also need to include the ID, because we have a column for ID. Right now, we're only showing the name and the email. So if we want these values to appear inside our table, what's the very first thing we need on line 34? Well, remember, this is going to happen repeatedly. So we don't necessarily want a T-body written again and again. Sorry? We will need a TD, but we need something before the TD. Right, we need to start a new row for each one. So we'll echo a TR and then walt a TD. So what should go in the first cell for every row? Look at our 3 headings. Right, so we want to put in our value. So our ID is going to go in the first cell. So we need to open a TD tag and then output the ID, and then we close the tag. What should come after we close that first cell? What do we need next? Right, we need to open a second TD tag, and the name. Then we're going to display the name inside the second cell. Then we're going to close our second column. How would we start our third column? Same way, open our third column. And then we no longer need a line break. What do we do after we display the email? We need to do two things with our table. Right, we'll close the TD. That closes the third and close the row. So for each record in the database, create a row, create a column, display the ID. Close the first column. Start the second column, print the name, close the second column. Open the third column, print the email, close the third column, and finish the row. Okay, let's see how that looks. Okay, now we're starting to get somewhere. Still doesn't look great, but it's better. And if we view our source, we've got all our tags get rendered. If we want, I mean, we could use some CSS. For now, I just want to say border equals 1. At least that will give us some grid lines on our table as well. Now we are missing one thing. This actually looks correct, but the HTML isn't quite valid. Everything we've done is okay. We need one thing. What should we do after our loop is finished? Right, we should close the table afterwards, because if we have more HTML on the page, it's going to potentially wind up inside our table. So after So start the table and print the heading, loop through our data, and output the 3 values in table cells. And when we're all done looping around, the table will close. So again, we don't care how many records there are in the database. It doesn't matter. I have 5 names in mine. If I have 50 names, this loop will run 50 times. If I have 100 names, the loop will run 100 times. It will display everything until there's no more data in the person's variable. Okay. What will happen if I have my page like this and I refresh it? There's 3 possibilities. It will still print the ID value. I'll get an error, or my page will load, but that first column will be blank. Which one do you think will happen? Will we get an error? Will we get a blank column? Or is it going to work properly? What do you think should happen in this case? You think it'll print the IDs? Yeah, the name, yep, so the name of the column is person ID. So if I call it ID instead, what do you expect will happen when we load in the browser? Sorry? Let's try it. Error. So 6 times, because I have 6 records, so my values are blank and we get this error. So undefined index means one of the values, and Emily, remember, as you said, it's an array, right? So value is an array, that value variable, it's an array of 3 items. And it has columns called name and email. It says, I don't know what this index, this element in the array called ID, it doesn't, I don't have it. Can't make sense of it, so it's going to generate an error. So the names in our database columns, they have to match exactly the values we're trying to display in our code. If those names don't match exactly, we get this undefined index error. So whenever you see this error, when you're selecting data, that means one of the fields we're trying to display, we've used the wrong name to try and access it. So that's always the clue. I should go back and check each value and make sure it matches the names of the columns in my database. Otherwise, we'll get that undefined index error. So that should fix this. So probably, I've been building web applications for 20 years now. I've never, ever built an application that doesn't have at least one page that looks kind of like this, although we hope it looks better. So showing data in HTML tables, if you look, I guarantee you, the next 5 websites you're on today, whatever they are, you're going to see a page that has this code behind it. We're going to see data. And the process is the same every time. Connect to the database, fetch a bunch of data, loop through it, and display it in TR and TD tags. So for example, a page like, we want to go here. So here's a common page we might see. This is running the exact same code we just wrote. Rogers has a database somewhere. It's got all the basketball data. There's a query that says, go and select all of the teams and all of the win-loss statistics. And if we inspect this element, we're probably going to find an HTML table in here. Okay, so they've used div tags, but they've used rows and columns for them, right? And they've just added some CSS, so we've got different color for the heading, and we've got this alternating rows, and eventually we'll learn how to do this as well. We can add a simple JavaScript to our table so that we can sort up and down. We'll add this in later on. It's a free library we can use. So the only things that are ever going to change are the query that we're writing. Depends what table are we wanting to display, and what are the names of the columns in the table. All the rest of this process is exactly the same. I know it's new. I know it might be confusing. That's okay, because we're going to do it again and again and again. Anytime we want to display data, here's the process. Connect to the database, run a select query, store the data, and use echo commands to print it out to the screen. And we'll use some kind of HTML wrapper around that data. In this case, we used a grid. In this case, we didn't really use any HTML wrapper. All we did was use a BR tag. We'll do another simple example where we'll use different HTML wrapping. So we want to do something like, let me just go in here for a minute. Okay, So in Blackboard, I have this ability. You guys don't because you're in the student role. But notice this element here. So when I click it, I get a bunch of choices. Where do these choices come from? Are they hard-coded into the HTML, into this page? Like, no. So where do those choices come from? Yeah, they're stored in the Blackboard database. Now, obviously, there's a lot more courses in the Blackboard's database than here, than just this list. How does it come up with this list? If you asked one of your other instructors to do this same thing, they'd have this list. They'd have a list, but their list would have different values, right? So where did this list come from? I mean, sorry, we know it comes from Blackboard. Why do we get these particular choices, Ralph? Right. So there's a query that fills this dropdown, but instead of just saying select star from courses, it would say select star from courses where instructor ID equals whatever my ID number is, right? There's some sort of filter. It's not giving all the courses. So if you ask Ben or Jonathan or somebody else, they would get, or Jessica, it would have been of a similar list, but the course values would be based on their instructor ID. But the process of this, it's the same as what we just did. This connects to the Blackboard database. It runs that select query. It uses a loop to populate each choice in the menu, but it's not using HTML TRs and TDs. It's using different set of tags, different wrapping around the values. So we'll try our own mini example. We'll build our own version of this. So we want to take all the names in our persons table and build a drop-down list where the user can click and get a list of names. And then they can pick one. So we'll make a new file. We'll make a new PHP file. We'll call it persons dropdown. So we want to build a similar drop-down list where you click it and it presents you a list of items that come from the database. I know we got a late start today. I just want to ask, does anybody have a class right after this one? You do? You have a class at 2 o'clock? Okay, is that 2? It's at 3. You have a class at 2? Okay. So let's put on a set of PHP tags. So this is what we're going to do. So almost the exact same process as before, except we're not using table, TR, and TD. We're going to use tags to create a drop-down list, like the one we're just looking at on Blackboard. So the first few steps, the first 4 lines of code, they're pretty much identical to what we've already done. We will create a new connection using PDO. Yes, I could copy the line, but the more I type it, the better I'm going to learn it. what does our query look like? I'm going to start with the word select. So we could select everything. That's probably not the most efficient way to do it because we only really want the names. So in that case, we don't necessarily need to select star because star selects all the IDs and all the emails as well. So we're getting 3 times as much data as we really need on this page. Our page will run faster, so we'll just select name from persons. So in this case, we'll ignore the IDs and the emails. It doesn't really matter when we have 6 items in the list, but if we have 6,000 items, asking for the IDs and emails and we don't need them will make our query take longer. We'll set up our command. And we'll execute our query. We have no parameters in our query, so we don't need any bind param method. So far, this code's pretty much what we've already done in our last page. What HTML tag do we use to generate one of those clickable drop-down lists? We'll need that, but that doesn't create the list itself. Yeah, we're going to need an HTML select. And we'll call it name. And maybe up here, I guess we'll actually set up this variable as well. So we will call fetch all just the way we did before, and we'll store that in a variable called person. And exact same code we used on our last page. And now we want to loop through our list. So we want to print out the name, but we want to print the name inside of our drop-down list. So Walt, you mentioned the tag we need. So what wrapping do we need before around the name? We need an HTML option tag. So this is going to print each name into a new item in the list. And when our loop is done, so in our last page, before and after our loop, we created and closed a table. And inside our loop, we created rows and columns. On this page, we're creating a drop-down list. And with our list of data, we're creating a set of options inside the list. To disconnect, we just close our connection. So if we go and load this page now, hopefully, we have a drop-down list with all of the names from our table. So I'm going to load my persons. Okay, so here's my drop-down list. And now when I click, I have all the items. If we view the source, we've got one select tag, and inside it we have a set of opening and closing option tags, where basically it's the same data we're queried before. We're just changing the wrapping around it. Instead of HTML table tags, we're wrapping it in select and option tags. So it's the same data, just presented differently. It's no different than taking the same gift, putting it in a gift bag, or putting it in wrapping paper. It's the same gift on the inside. We're just changing how it's presented. So all the code up to here, everything above and below is really the same as on the previous page. Connect to the database, run a query, get the data, and store the results in a variable or an array. So we've written 3 different pages that display data from the persons table. Most of the code is the same each time. The only thing that really changes is what does the display look like? In this page, we didn't format it at all. In this page, we formatted it as a grid. In this page, we formatted it as a drop-down instead. So these mechanics we're going to do over and over again. So Emily, coming back to the conversation we had during that first exercise, if it's looking 1% more familiar now than it did then, that's a step in the right direction. Okay, that's the idea. We will do it repeatedly because this process never changes. This is the only way we can display data from a database. Connect, write a query, store the results, figure out how are we displaying it. In a table, in an email, in a drop-down, in a bulleted list, as an image or something else. And we'll try all of these different ways. Okay, so we'll keep doing this. Okay, I'm going to give you your first lab, but I have to change the instructions a little bit because I know not everybody has access to their database. So bear with me for a second. Okay. So you do not need to create a database for this. Okay. You can all just connect to my database. I will build the table and insert all the records. So here are the credentials you need. So you have to build one page. Call it lab1.php. Your page should connect to the database, select all the data from the teams table, and build an HTML table. So you don't have to do this. Test your page on your local web server. And upload your file to Blackboard. So basically your lab1 file should pretty much look like this, with the 16 hockey teams being displayed. So I will upload all the code we did today to GitHub so you can use that as a reference. You can watch the video. You don't need to make the drop-down page. You don't need to make the unformatted page. Just one file that will look much like this, but won't be connected to the persons table, be connected to the teams table. I have put them in the instruction. The table is teams, and the column names you need to display are city, nickname, and division, all lowercase. That's it. Okay. I'm going to make one strong recommendation. This is a pretty simple lab. Yes, you could copy all this code from GitHub, paste it, and just change the names, and it will probably work. And you will learn nothing. The idea of the lab is to get you to practice it so that you start to understand how it works and learn what you're doing. So try to write it. Use the code, my code that's on GitHub as a reference, or your own. If your file is working from today, great. Use it as a reference. Don't just copy and paste it and rename. Because the idea is for you to practice this so you get comfortable doing it. Okay? It's not due until Monday at 5 o'clock. So this shouldn't take very long at all to do. So I'll create the database. I'll put the data in it for you. Just connect, build the one page, upload it to Blackboard. That's it. Does anybody have any questions, any other questions about the lab? Yes. Okay, that is it for today. I will create the database right now for you. And all you need to do is connect to it, run the query, and display the data. Okay, so the table and all 16 teams are in the database now. So if you connect to it, you'll be able to see so this is what the data looks like in the database. I basically want you to make a PHP page that displays this same table. So you just need to change the query, change the column headings in your table, change the column name values in your loop. You're done. That's it. Okay. That's all for today. I will see you guys next week. Sure. On this page? Yep. I will upload all this code to GitHub in just a minute as well. Okay.